Yeah, thanks very much for that embarrassingly long introduction. It's also great to be back on campus. It's too many decades ago for me to compute the exact number of days. But yeah, the title of this talk is, of course, a nod that some of you will recognize to a famous paper by the physicist Eugene Wigner on the unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics and physics. And just to give away the punchline here, I'm interested in the role that mathematics might play in psychology, and in particular of a group of individuals who call themselves mathematical psychologists, who are often very much motivated by the role that mathematics played in physics, and questions about why that particular movement only has gone as far as it has so far, and maybe hasn't been as effective as many of its adherents would want it to be. And the story I'm going to tell is partly historical story, but also with some philosophical discussion of what the prospects are for mathematical psychology. Has a very California feel to it. This is an image from 1967 at the Institute for Mathematical Studies in the Social Sciences, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that organization and some of the people who appear here in a moment. But on the first row, just to get some names out there, in particular, Richard Atkinson, who some of you will know was president of the entire UC at one point, and also in his career, director of the National Science Foundation, and Bill Estes are going to feature. People who were associated with IMSSS at this time include the philosopher Pat Suppes, Bob Bjork, of course, who made his career here at UCLA, and Jim Townsend, who I'll talk about as one of the three figures that was mentioned in the abstract that I sent. So partly this is, like all histories, going to be only a partial history. But here's Bjork writing actually in the early 70s about this field called mathematical psychology that very much has a beginning there at Stanford. Saying we tend to think of it as a recent development within psychology, partly because of that Stanford program in the 60s. But it probably started somewhere around 1950, and I'll show you a timeline. But as George Miller, famous magical number 7 Miller, said, psychology's had a long and not always happy affair with mathematics. And that interaction is still part of what's ongoing in thinking about what's going on in mathematical psychology. This was an article that Bjork wrote that was primarily addressed to psychology undergraduates. And here he says, important point is that mathematical psychology is not an area of study like memory or concepts or whatever, decision making. It's an approach to studying those things. To know that someone is a mathematical psychologist says nothing about the theoretical biases they have, just that they are an adherent of the mathematical psychology approach. So this, as I've indicated, is part of a larger project. We've been interviewing some of the key figures who are still around. I was put up to it. I did time at Indiana University. Sounds like actually I did time in Texas. That was more right. I enjoyed my time at Indiana University. And Rich Schifrin, who was in that picture, was one of the. I think he was the second year of the student intake to that program. At some point said, somebody should write a history of mathematical psychology and you should do it. And I was like, I'm not a historian, but I am a kind of historically oriented philosopher of science. And I had, in my time at Indiana, really come to understand that there was something unusual going on among the psychologists there that even as I thought I was a pretty well-informed cognitive science, philosopher of cognitive science person, I hadn't really seen in such depth before. So this is part of this larger project. And just to give you a little bit of background from the history and philosophy of science, sort of one of the founding figures, Lakatos, said philosophy of science without history of science is empty. History of science without philosophy of science is blind. He's riffing on something that Kant said about philosophy more generally. But very much we think you don't really understand why people are having the arguments they're having unless you understand how they got to that point. And that's also been a big part of my career. So as was mentioned, I did my PhD here at a time when Robert Seyfarth and Dorothy Cheney were here and working on vervet monkey alarm calls. So my dissertation was actually about the meaning of of alarm calls in vervet monkeys. But I noticed even then that psychologists and ethologists, people with a more evolutionary biology background, tended to think about these questions rather differently. And it's partly because of the training they received and the history of those different disciplines that are now very much more intermingled than they were 30, 40 years ago. So just to give a bit more context here, historians, I think, tend to focus on particular social and political contexts. And historians of science are a bit unusual and a little bit old-fashioned among historians because they tend to focus on the intellectual context, and the history of ideas is not a fashionable thing in many history departments, but it's still very much alive in departments of history and philosophy of science, such as the one at Pitt and the one at Indiana. Philosophers, to their detriment, sometimes tend towards abstraction, right? Search for timeless truths with varying degrees of specificity. And philosophers of science look to science to kind of figure out what to say about epistemology, how we know things, and also ontology or metaphysics, what there is, and with varying degrees of specificity. So some parts of philosophy of science are highly abstract questions like, what is a law of nature? What is causation? Where they've often just sampled some very thinly a few examples like Newton's laws. Whereas historians and philosophers of science, HBS researchers, tend to want a middle ground between that abstraction and that specificity. So we think there's a lot to be gained by looking at particular episodes of science, current, ongoing, or past, and trying to figure out what's going on in those, with the worry that maybe it doesn't generalize to all of the science, but we learn something very important about how we learn things in particular areas of science. So my approach is very much in that latter category. And here, some of you know George Box's statement, all models are wrong, some are useful. This is something that mathematical psychologists repeat to each other a lot. It applies to histories as well, because we have to pick and choose where we're even going to start the story. I started you with a picture of Stanford in 1967. Why start there? Bjork said 1950s. Why start there? Why not go back to the 19th century and psychophysics? And so anywhere we start involves some compromises, but I'm going to make a distinction that historians often make between deep history and history of specific episodes. So we'll say a little bit about that 19th century context and the early 20th century context, but then really dive into what was going on in the 1960s and 70s. So what is mathematical psychology? You could approach this in perhaps three different ways. You could say, are there shared questions and approaches to answering them? You've already seen Bjork saying it's not really shared questions, but it is shared approaches. I think there might be some shared questions as well, so maybe I don't quite believe what Bjork said there. Just who are the people who self-identify as mathematical psychologists, and some of the individuals in this photo are largely in that. And then what are the institutional trappings, right? They have a journal, they have a society, they have a conference. When do those happen? Who is behind them again, right? We can look at it from that way. So here's the longer list of names here. All but one is identified, which is the fellow sitting on the left in this second row back. So if anybody recognizes him, please let me know who that is. But there are a number of well-known and highly cited figures in this picture, including David Rumelhart, McClellan, connectionism, neural networks. Here we are, right? So you can see people with all kinds of important influences there. Here's a rough timeline. So the Center for Advanced Study in Behavioral Sciences originated at Stanford in 1954, largely with input from Pat Suppies, the philosopher, and Bill Estes, who I'll say more about in a moment, goes there for one of their summer sessions and meets Pat Suppies, and a whole bunch of discussions ensue, and then summer institutes that have, they have the first one in 1957 with Ken Arrow of Arrow's paradox, voting paradox fame, Suppies himself, Fred Terman, who was the provost at Stanford at the time, Chomsky was there, and George Miller, who I mentioned already. And then they institute the IMSSS with Suppies as its inaugural director, which is a position he held until he retired, that started a graduate program and started bringing graduate students specifically to take this mathematical approach towards psychology. Jim Townsend, who I'll mention again, already mentioned, arrives as a first-year student in 1961 to study with Atkinson. And then a series of things that I'm not going to step through in a lot of detail, but you can see the foundation, some handbooks, and then the journal in 64, and then a bunch of conferences. One of the things that part of the story I won't tell today, but one of the things that it ties into this theme of the unreasonable ineffectiveness is that the conferences were sort of well attended, but attendance was really dwindling towards the late 90s and early 2000s. And there were two big branches going on in mathematical psychology at the time. One was stuff that Suppies was really invested in, which is the foundations of measurement. So he was an author on this ultimately 3-volume Foundations of Measurement, trying to put scientific measurement on an axiomatic foundation with Krantz and other psychologists, Luce and Tversky of Tversky and Kahneman fame. And that particular branch is very dry and technical and not very experimental. And I think it sort of drove away a lot of people. The experimentalists, represented by Atkinson, were sort of losing interest in going to that conference. Atkinson, by that time, was off doing his more administrative things, so he wasn't actually actively a researcher at that point. But Rich Schifrin had the idea in 2008 that they could revive interest in the society and its meetings by co-locating them with the Cognitive Science Society meetings. And they, in fact, did that for about a decade. They actually held the meeting just before or just after, and attendance is up and has stayed up ever since, right? So allying with another organization was a strategy there. So what about the deep history of mathematical psychology? So, famously, Galileo says the book of nature is written in a mathematical language. Here's Schifrin excerpted from that photo. He doesn't look anywhere near as young anymore, but all sciences move in the direction of becoming quantitative as time passes. So you might think that use of mathematics in any science is just an inevitability, but it's by no means a foregone conclusion exactly how that will play out. If we go back to the 19th century, where did it first start getting mathematical? One person that mathematical psychologists talk about amongst themselves is Friedrich Herbart, who was actually an introspectionist, not an experimentalist. In fact, he thought that doing experimental psychology on humans was not possible to do the kinds of experiments you need to do. But he thought from your own introspection, you could come up with some mathematical representation of how ideas came up and went away. So he developed this whole mathematical model for how ideas compete and how the strength of ideas therefore changes over time. And he actually argued that mathematics was essential given that you couldn't experiment. But perhaps fortunately, that wasn't the end of the story. So many of you will know the history of psychophysics and the development of more experimental approaches, where the goal is to try to link certain kinds of human responses to physical variations in the stimuli. So Weber's law, which was stated in words, and then Fechner afterwards formalized it as a piece of mathematics and formulated his own law, talks about how there's a characteristic curve that as the stimulus intensity increases, you have to have a bigger increase to get the same noticeable difference, right? So that's beginning of mathematization. So Duncan Luce, who's a big part of the story, was for many years at UC Irvine, puts it this way. He says, mathematics is the study of structures. The existence of psychological structure cannot be in doubt. So the existence of psychological structure means that mathematical theories are at least in principle a possibility in psychology. So there's a real move here from the kind of psychophysics where the mathematics is describing behavior in experiments to actually trying to get at the psychological structure internal to the subject or the organism. So that very much aligns it with a shift from a kind of behavioristic perspective on how to do psychology to a more cognitive perspective. And Luce himself, borrows the usual metaphor of what's going on here is opening the black box, but getting at that in a way which lends itself to a kind of mathematical formalization. So an important distinction here then is between phenomenal models, which relate independently measurable variables directly, right, to process models, which posit some kind of internal set of unobservable events to account for what it is that you observe. And this distinction is quite central to a lot of the writing of the mathematical psychologists in the 70s, 80s, 90s. And I think as a philosopher, we can look at this distinction and ask, how good a distinction is it? It's one that's actually also borrowed from physics. So, Newton famously with his laws was embarrassed that he had action at a distance. He had no idea how gravity, right, could have an effect over these great distances. The phenomenal law that relates the behavior of the planets to the mass of the sun is one that doesn't posit a process at all. It just tells you here's what you'll measure if you plug in the right values. And this distinction seems clear enough at the outset, but there are reasons perhaps for thinking that it's not as clear as one might like it to be. So I'm not going to go into this in depth, but this is J.P. Gamboa, a former student of mine from Pitt, who published a couple of years ago this paper arguing that trying to separate exactly what makes something a phenomenological model versus a process model is by no means a straightforward task, because many of the phenomenological models say a little bit about what kinds of processes might be going on underneath them. And even things that psychologists call process models, or math psychologists call process models, themselves aren't very specific about the mechanisms, right? So it's a kind of maybe a gradation rather than a clean-cut distinction here. But that's an interesting philosophical question, and it's also part of what I will do when I'm writing up that part of the book about what these psychologists mean by this. I frame this slide in terms of, well, what about dynamical systems? Because in philosophy, there's been a lot of discussion about dynamical approaches to cognition as an alternative to standard computation-based theories of mind. Atkinson's own history is interesting in this respect. He had been an undergrad at University of Chicago, where he worked with Nicholas Reshevsky, who termed himself a mathematical biologist, was very much interested in coming up with mathematical models of cells, but also wrote a lot about psychology and neuroscience. And Atkinson had this comment from our interview. He said, all the work of Reshevsky was really done in the framework of Newtonian physics, the dynamical aspect of it. The equations that you look at in a book on Newtonian physics were the equations that Reshevsky was trying to sort of force into a description of the activities of the cell or the like. And it was interesting to me, but it never really coupled with the data. He also said something very similar about the famous Herbert Simon at CMU, who was pioneer of artificial intelligence, won the Nobel Prize, who pushed ahead with building programs that could play chess, but never really coupled those programs to human data about playing chess. Later in his career, he got more interested in that, but initially it was very much about just getting something that you kind of look at and go, that's kind of what a human would do, right? Wasn't tightly coupled to the data. Atkinson himself became more interested in the work of Bill Estes, who I mentioned before, and he went to Indiana to study with Estes. Estes left for Stanford while he was there, so he finished under Cletus Burke. But here's what he said about Estes. He said what was clear about the Estes approach was, first of all, that it emphasized probability theory, and the idea of formulating psychological processes in terms of probability theory was very appealing to me. So Estes had a stimulus sampling approach. So you store a trace of your stimulus, and then learning is a matter of being able to sample from those stored instances. There's a description of a process there. So Atkinson said, I did my thesis on that. It's also interesting to note that Estes' publication in 1950 towards a statistical theory of learning was a real break from his own advisor, the arch behaviorist B.F. Skinner, who, they had a bit of a teasing love-hate relationship, I would say, right? So in his 1954 volume, Estes wrote that the older frameworks, people like Skinner and Hull from behaviorism, were woefully inadequate, often embarrassingly so. And And Skinner teased back that Estes project was a kind of war-inflicted disability. He said Estes' brilliant career as an experimentalist soon yielded to mathematical model building from which he suffered for many years, right? So you can see there's some tension here in just how one should go about actually doing psychology, not just of humans, but of animals too. Sulpice, on the other hand, in his remembrance of Estes after he died, wrote, for the first time, an approach to learning theory had a framework of concepts that permitted serious mathematical development and thereby a variety of quantitative predictions that could be thoroughly tested. And so Estes ends up at Stanford partly as part of this program that Sulpice was building. And sort of the idea that we're going to do mathematics and build good theories of processes, not just phenomenal level descriptions of things that we can measure observationally, it becomes key here. So here's, again, that same picture, but I want to focus a little bit on Sulpice. He's not in the picture, although he was definitely around at the time. Sulpice was kind of a very effective mover and shaker on the Stanford campus, knew all the top administrators, and organized, as I said, the Summer Institute that had various well-known figures there, became the director of the IMSSS, and an initial volume there, and notably got a $1 million grant out of the Carnegie Corporation that enabled Stanford to buy its first PDP-1 computer. At the same time, in fact, that Herb Simon and CMU got an identical grant for an identical piece of hardware. So these two things are going along in parallel. But what's going on at Stanford is the recognition that you can use these computers not just to build programs that can do things that might look like the things that humans do, but you can actually build them to run your experiments. You can gather data with the computer, and then you can model the data and explore the parameter space of your model and try to generate new experiments from this. So that was a very, very important aspect of what was going on at Stanford at the time. Terman, by the way, is sometimes known as the father of Silicon Valley because he also recognized Stanford's location among this sort of very tech-oriented population was a real opportunity for the university. Just a couple of quotes from Townsend, though, about this program that they were graduate students in. So Townsend was a first-year student. Schifrin came in the second year, and the various other people. Bjork was there as well. Townsend described it as almost a marine-like thing. He says he describes taking the measurement theory class. When I took the class, it had about 50 people. To start with, Pat came in with a big stack of IBM cards that had everyone's name on them, and he would come up with questions in mathematical logic and pick out a card, and he was like, Townsend, what's the law of equal potentiality? And so the next day, there was about half the class, and the people would move back a couple of rows, and the class, after 2 weeks, was down to about 5 people, and Pat didn't care, right? He really just wanted the people who were there, and we wish we could be so cavalier about our class attendance now, but that was then. Townsend, I complained to Atkinson about the additional work that was required by SSS students. They were psychology students, but they were actually in a separate building and going through these classes that the others didn't have to take. He simply said, it's good for you, and walked off. So that was the kind of attitude there. You got almost like a marine-like thing. You guys are special, but you better live up to it. So again, complaining students, nothing new about the level of work, right? But there was definitely an esprit de corps established among this group. I think that's an important part of the historical story about sort of all the developments that have happened. But it wasn't to everyone's taste. So Beth Loftus, a long time at UCI, was in that program. She's in the photo. There she is. In terms of the mathematical psychology that I was listening to in the talks in the Friday seminar, it just bothered me that they would make assumptions about human behavior in order to make the mathematics tractable. That didn't really make sense, assuming things were random when they weren't, and stuff like that. And she goes on to say she spent a lot of time writing letters to her uncle and hemming skirts and things in the back of the room. And of course has gone on to have a brilliant career, as many of you know, especially dealing with false memories in courtroom testimony. That's the thing she's most famous for, but has done a lot of things. So even those who went through the program weren't all indoctrinated into this particular way of doing things. And I think there are interesting questions about that. But even though it wasn't to everyone's taste, essential perhaps nonetheless. So Daniel Navarro wrote this paper a couple of years ago. If mathematical psychology did not exist, we might need to invent it. A comment on theory building in psychology, and I will come back to this in the second part of the talk here. Navarro was trained at UCI under one of the mathematical psychologists who went through so there's a lineage there that you can link them to. This idea that even now there's something that's missing in psychology. Much of this is prompted by the replication crisis. There's a lack of good theory, and if we only did better mathematics in our theory building, we would be better off than we are with respect to psychology. So just then trying to map out some of these lineages. This is a very partial map that's based on data that you can get from the neurotree.org. And, you know, I've already talked about Stanford. There's a big Indiana connection here. I've already mentioned that Atkinson went there to study with Estes. Estes had studied there. Skinner was at Indiana for a while also. And then Irvine becomes a big part of this story as well. But of course, you have people like Bjork here at UCLA. Michigan is also going to be an important part of this story. But this is just to give a sense of the kind of mapping that we can do. And if you look at the Bjorks, both of them, you see there's Bjork. This is directly from the Neurotree site rather than my prettified version of it. But he counts Bauer, who's in that photo, Atkinson, who's in that photo, and Estes, right, as advisors here. Elizabeth Bjork was actually studied with Estes, not at Stanford. Excuse me, she did go to Stanford and study with Estes. No, she didn't. Sorry, get my facts straight. She went to Michigan, but she had studied with Estes at home. Right? So they met at Michigan before coming here. So anyway, trying to get these lineages and what the intellectual influences are as part of the project. So here comes to the part that's really in the abstract, which is where I'm sort of trying to say what to make of the kind of hand-wringing that has gone on among mathematical psychologists about the relative ineffectiveness of their approach within psychology itself. So there are some obvious things. You'll get Townsend saying things like, I won't do a slide on this, but you know, he laments that most psychology majors join the major because it's not as math heavy as certain other majors. And so there's a real dearth of people who have the kind of skills. And again, talking to these individuals, people like Townsend, Schifrin, and so on, many of them backed into psychology from other disciplines where they were already doing a lot of mathematics. So they had that prior bias, as it were, towards looking at things. And in this paper from 2008, the setting for this little tale that I'm going to tell you, Townsend says, well, I want to tell you about continued development of areas of mathematical psychology and rumors of demise. So remember, 2008 was that year when Schifrin first relocated the conference alongside Cognitive Science Society. So there was real hand-wringing going on among the people involved in mathematical psychology about whether they were a dying branch, as it were, of psychology. I'm going to start, though, with Schifrin, a paper that's actually written a couple of years later, where perhaps optimism coming back because the relocation with cognitive science has sort of boosted attendance again. In a paper he wrote for Topics in Cognitive Science about the benefits of modeling, mathematical modeling in particular. And I'm not going to read this passage to you, but it's sort of all of the obvious things that you would think of. You can be more precise, you can make more precise predictions, you can work out more clearly what the consequences are. Here's a bit more of a schematic list of those benefits that I just pulled straight out of that paper. But these are all things that you wouldn't think are particularly unique to psychology or cognitive science. This is just true everywhere, right? So part of the question is, well, how in particular does it help psychology other than this general way? And one of the things that Schifrin says in this paper is that given the complexity of the human mind or brain, every task is subject to all kinds of influences. And the goal of modeling is to enable progress in our understanding, and I've highlighted that term, of this vastly complex system. Even the models that do this well are in almost all cases relatively crude. So this is the all models are wrong, but some are useful. We get some understanding from even quite simplified models of the processes that we posit to be going on underneath the measurable phenomena. So this word understanding is one of those red flag words I highlighted in yellow, but for philosophers of science, what the heck is understanding, right? It's a real black box. And this is just to show that, he iterates this word understanding. This is the benefit. Besides all those things, it gives us a kind of understanding of the processes at work, which again, you might say is not particularly psychological yet. That might be true in other fields also. But what we've got going on with brains and minds is a system whose complexity is much greater than almost anything else studied in science, right? The solar system is pretty complex, but it's, depending who's counting and in which decade we're in, 9 planets or 8, take your pick, and a sun and a few other smaller objects that are not exerting big gravitational influences, so we can sort of ignore those for lots of purposes and get a pretty good model of the dynamics of the solar system from a relatively simplified model. But here you've got 86 billion neurons with an average of 100,000 connections to other neurons per neuron, all doing a whole myriad electrical and biochemical things. It's just really hard to get a handle on all of that. And so you might wonder whether or not this is the kind of system which is going to make the kind of simplified models that one could write at all useful. And I think that's part of the skepticism that even Skinner had about this approach, which is that, he was a dedicated environmentalist in psychology. We had to explain what what organisms are doing in terms of environmental conditions, right? But the environment itself is so complex that you couldn't have a good mathematical model of that, right? But nevertheless, these mathematical psychologists are arguing that we can get enough of that structure and enough of a representation of the psychological processes to be actually making progress on explanation. So going back to Townsend's paper 2 years earlier, I just did a search inside the paper for the word understand or understanding, and he doesn't talk about understanding at all, right? And what's key here is that there's, for him, a lot of hand-wringing about whether or not there are good theories in psychology. So he says, one of the blessings and curses of modern psychology is the everlasting quest for effects. Some of our most famous investigators made their name by discovery of a novel and enchanting effect, right? So the McGurk illusion or Stroop effect or whatever, right? In some cases, these have led to a rich set of phenomena and interesting, if rarely conclusive, explanatory models or theories. But in general, he thinks that this chasing after effects has been a bad thing for psychology. And if we come back to the replication crisis, it's things like the dirty desk effect that's supposed to affect whether or not you grade more harshly or less harshly. Those are the things that have proven hardest to replicate, right? They're very splashy when they get published, but then they don't replicate well. And there isn't much solid theory underneath those discoveries. Now, lack of theory, right, is not per se an issue in Townsend's own paper. So I actually went through and sort of found all the phrases that have the word theory in them. And there are theories throughout. But what I want to say is that these are largely, not entirely, because some of these are the kinds of things that he wants to promote in thinking about having better theories. But many of these are best sort of small descriptions of small phenomena, and there's no kind of underarching framework. Although, mathematical learning theory, we've already seen some of the origins of math psych itself coming from attempts to formalize learning. Estes. Signal detection theory also plays a huge part in mathematical psychology for thinking about how people make perceptual categorization decisions, right? So some of these theories are tending towards what I call big T theory, but a lot of them are like small T theories. They're little theories of things that don't add up to a big theory. But what Townsend says, his view of mathematical psychology is that it serves as a stiff antidote to the affections of effect philia and cul-de-sacs of overindulged operationalism. Now, some big words there, but the behaviorists were very much about operationalizing all the concepts and not really opening up that black box, right? There's a big literature on how to think about that. But Townsend really sees this approach to building theory stated in mathematical terms as a way to actually connect all these different effects in various ways and get beyond just reducing our psychological terms to things that we directly measure. So interlude, right, in this tale here on Sail Outside, right, philosophers of science offer various accounts of scientific explanations. So the Stanford Encyclopedia has a whole article on scientific explanation. The Philosophy of Science Archive has a whole bunch of papers that you can search through about explanation. And Phil Papers, which is another philosophy project, also has a whole bunch of links to things about explanation. And in this Stanford Encyclopedia article, which is written by my former Pitt colleague Jim Woodward and Lauren Ross, who's a former student of his now at UC Irvine in their Logic and Philosophy of Science department, sort of says, well, maybe the emerging consensus here is that there's no one-size-fits-all model of explanation. How explanation works is going to vary depending on which science you're looking at and what kind of thing you're trying to explain. So this is very much in that HPS mode, right? It's like we're not going after some general abstract conception of understanding, right, or explanation. What we're going after is how does explanation and understanding work in this field and in that field and in some other field? So they say at the end of this, it's conceivable that the differences between biologists and physicists who refer alternately to mechanisms or laws in their explanations, it's conceivable that that difference is purely terminological, but it's also worth exploring the possibility that there's a distinctive story to be told about what a mechanism is as understood by biologists and how information contributes to explanation in that field that wouldn't work in physics at all, right? So what we have here then is a concern about differences among sciences and what works, and that opens up the possibility that the mathematical models might be really good for physics, but not very good for psychology, right? But nevertheless, that's not the consensus view among mathematical psychologists. One also interesting thing that you can do is go in and look for explanation in this Phil Sci archive, and you will see that plurality represented. So the very first paper that came up when I did this search was the role of mathematics in scientific explanation. Then a reference to Hempel. I won't go into what his theory of explanation was. Topological explanations, third. Mechanistic explanations, fourth. So again, you see that kind of diversity of what we mean by explanation and what might count as an explanation in different fields represented there. So is there a single model of explanation? The kind of building consensus here is maybe no. Whereas if you go back to Hempel, whom I mentioned just now, in the middle of the 20th century, or second half of the 20th century, the idea was explanation is just the reverse of prediction. You have some laws, you have some statement of the initial conditions, you derive some state of the world just logically from those. If you're deriving forward in time, you're predicting, and if you're deriving backward in time, you're explaining, right? That's the whole story, basically, for explanation in that. But we now think that there's much more diversity here. All right, so end of that interlude, and back to another pub or publication, and this Navarro paper, right? Why might we need to invent it? And again, this is very much a reaction, this paper published in 2021, to the replication crisis and what's perceived among mathematical psychologists as a shortage of what I'm calling big T theory, right? Theories that sort of can frame the whole field, like Darwin's theory does for biology, Einstein before Newton did for physics, and so on. And Navarro suggests that there is one counterexample in Shepard's law of generalization and various Bayesian extensions of it to make the case that this can be done. So Shepard in 1958 had published this paper in which he tried to understand stimulus generalization. So if you train an animal to respond to some colored light and later give it another light that's slightly different in hue, the animal will still respond to some degree, but there's a characteristic drop-off. The further away you get from the trained stimulus, the less strong that response is. So this is an empirically derived curve of that drop-off based on difference in a bunch of different stimulus types, right? And what Shepard does is postulate, and I'm not going to step you through the math here, but he postulates a certain kind of model of learning in which these traces are getting stored, and then they're being accessed during the response to the novel stimuli. And the shape of this curve he derives is this one at 18 and re-represents at 19 as having this exponential shape. So here is Navarro's explanation of this. So what she writes is that Shepard showed that under a range of assumptions that a learner might make about the nature of consequential regions, like what matters for the task at hand in the stimulus, the shape of the generalization function across the stimulus space ends up being approximately exponential. But she says the real success is not actually coming up with this exponential form, right? But giving you an explanation, a mathematical explanation of why it's exponential. And so this is her rendering of it on the right. Shepard has something similar in his original paper. But if we think about it, you've been presented with a stimulus, all right? And now you have to decide how far are you going to generalize that along various feature dimensions of that stimulus. And maybe it's color in one dimension and maybe it's shape in another dimension. You can think about all of the possible regions of interest that might overlap with the stimulus you've initially been seeing. And if you think about it, there are lots of tiny areas that overlap with that initial stimulus in the center, but there are also lots of big areas that overlap with that. But because they all overlap in the middle, you get a peak in the middle of the overlapping of all the possible areas that could be the ones of interest. And when you sort of do the mathematics on this, you end up with this peaked curve here that has an exponential form. It's jagged in this diagram because this is just a finite discrete simulation of it, but you can derive a continuous form from it. So as Navarro says, taken by itself, Shepard's reanalysis would have been impressive. However, Shepard went on to provide a theoretical explanation for why we should expect to find this invariance, and the theory was surprisingly simple, and that's what I've just shown you. Right? So Shepard himself in that paper, sorry, not in that paper, but in a later paper that he wrote, reflecting on his career as a psychologist, so in 1987, explicitly again goes back to physics as the model here. Right? So he writes, the tercentenary of the publication of Newton's Principia prompts the question of whether psychological science has any hope of achieving a law that's comparable in generality, if not in predictive accuracy, to Newton's universal law of gravitation. Townsend, though, says, I believe that this field, so this is writing some 20 years later, is and will continue to be of interest, so he's talking about mathematical psychology, not only to the behavioral and biological sciences, but also to philosophy of science and epistemology and physics, although at present the substrata relate to Newtonian rather than relativistic physics. So he wants to say psychology has a long way to go to develop the kinds of mathematical models that we take for granted in physics to get something of the universality. And the worry then about Shepard's article is it's just this one tiny little thing studied in very restricted circumstances, and it's still not something on which you can build the kind of big T theory that we're talking about. So here's Navarro talking about it. Shepard's article presented no new empirical data, mostly devoted to the derivation of a formal relation between one unobservable quantity, psychological distance, how similar are these, and another, stimulus generalizability. I use it as an example of theory building in psychology. So again, in a very HPS way, we're focusing on a particular example to draw some lessons from it. but she says it's the explanation of the law that's of value, not the exponential law itself. It's the method that she's trying to argue for here. So as she says, his claim to generality arises not from any statistical quantification, but from the formal structure of the theory. And this goes back to the philosophy of science literature because we have questions about whether or not there are genuine mathematical explanations of physical phenomena. What is it to be a mathematical explanation rather than some other kind of mechanistic or law-based explanation? And here's the worry, all right? So the data that Shepard actually builds his account on is collected in experiments with a very simple apparatus with very simple stimuli, such as this. Yet at the end of his paper in 1987, where he's reflecting on this, he goes, what we have here is something that can help us understand the problem that a positive or negative encounter with an unfamiliar object poses for an individual. So he's imagining you're well, I just heard today about the project that is going on with lizards and their possible responses to cats, right? So you've encountered a cat for the first time. And the question is, how should you generalize your negative experience with this one cat to other things that are vaguely cat-like, right? He says, a bird that ingested a caterpillar bearing particular coloration and markings found it delectable or sickening must decide whether another object of more or less similar visual experience is of the same natural kind and should therefore be seized or avoided. So he thinks that he's got something that speaks to this, but it's derived from these really trivial kinds of experimental situations. There's no cat, there's nothing like a threat here, right? There's a big gap between what you can do and what you can't do. So and what you can generalize from it. And so Navarro talks about this at some length. Again, I'm not going to read this, but the too long didn't read version is that the challenge of formal modeling drives mathematical psychologists towards narrow phenomena that can be controlled in the lab. And the worry is that in doing so, their experiments look increasingly less relevant to the things that many psychologists really care about, right? Be it stereotype threat or whatever it is that you're interested in social psychology, right? And that's kind of an essential tension, and I think gets at this issue of, why the mathematics, as interesting as it is as ineffective as it is when we're dealing with real-world phenomena that psychologists are interested in. So an epilogue, right, is to say, my project is not just to tell this story and sort of tease apart these themes, but also maybe to bring some more modern philosophy of science to bear on what's going on here. So the philosophy of science has moved on since Townsend learned any of it, and even since Navarro did. Navarro cites hacking, but that's already over 30 years old, and really as a cautionary tale rather than a constructive one. So again, in philosophy of science, the work on explanation emphasizes plurality, lots of different explanations, and context specificity. Like, depending what you're doing, you want a different kind of explanation. Philosophers have worked a lot on mechanistic explanations, but they've mostly focused on biology and neuroscience and its relation to cognitive science. Causal explanation has been thought about quite abstractly. Mathematical explanation is driven by toy examples. So one suggestion going back in the other direction is that by paying attention to mathematical psychology, its successes and failures, we can have a better stock of examples for our thinking about I'm having trouble with that word today, plurality of explanation in the sciences and in psychology in particular. So this is, as I said, part of this larger project. We've interviewed a number of people and we're grateful for their time. And I have 4 current or former students from Pitt who have helped with the interviews and are going to be helping with the write-up. So thanks for your attention. I look forward to questions.